In this demo, we're going to discuss NAT on our network security appliance. We're already logged in once again to our security appliance configuration utility. We'll begin by looking at the WAN configuration on the network security appliance. If we look under IP4 config and scroll to the bottom, you'll notice that we're using a static IP address, 192.168.5.1. That may be a little confusing because that's a private IP address, but we're actually utilizing this appliance in a test network. And so that's a simulated WAN address, even though it appears to be a private address. So in this case, we have assigned 192.168.5.1 to our WAN interface, but we can also add IP aliases to our WAN interface. So in addition to 5.1, we've also added 192.168.5.2 as an additional IP alias to the WAN interface, and also 5.3. So each of those three addresses are available for use on the WAN interface. So in the network security appliance, we configure NAT underneath routing. So we'll look under routing, and underneath routing, you'll see that the routing mode between the WAN and the LAN is actually defaulted to NAT. Our network security appliance, by default, since it's for a small business type of environment, uses one IP address that's valid for the outside world and then allows you to use the internal addressing throughout the network. Now, you can also turn NAT off and use classic routing, and in that case, you'll use the classic routing tables and RIP, and you can set static routes, and you can set dynamic routes just as you would in a normal router. But for our purposes, NAT is enabled, and NAT is functioning to take our 1 and now 2 and 3 IP addresses on the external interface and translate them to internal interfaces. In the network security appliance, the way that you configure the NAT is through firewall rules. So firewall rules incorporate the NAT settings as part of the configuration. Because the network security appliance defaults to using NAT, the functionality for NAT configuration is built right into the firewall rules. So first we're going to look at rules that we created earlier. First is a LAN to WAN rule. We'll click on Edit. And in this LAN to WAN rule, where we're going from the secure LAN to the unsecure internet, we have the ability to set our source NAT settings. And what we are choosing when we choose our source NAT settings is which IP address on the external interface is going to be used for NAT. Which IP address will be translated. We're talking about network address translation. And so the internal IP addresses will be translated to an external IP address. And so we can choose which one that will be. We can choose the WAN interface, which is 5.1, or we can choose single address, which allows us to choose one of the two IP aliases that we created, either 5.2 or 5.3. So we'll go ahead and choose 5.2 as the address interface that we're going to be using for LAN to WAN communications. This is very similar to dynamic NAT in the traditional NAT world. All right, so we've changed that. Now let's take a look at one of our WAN to LAN. In this case, we'll use our WAN to DMZ firewall rule that we created earlier. And if we look at this, this is coming from the unsecure network to one of our more secure networks, our DMZ. And if we scroll down, here we have the option to set destination NAT settings. We set an internal IP address for the internal server that we're going to be hitting. And we also, in this case, enabled port forwarding to translate the port number. But the important piece of this is, once again, which of the IP addresses that are available to us on the external side is the IP address that's going to translate to this internal server. This setting is very similar to what we would call static NAT in the traditional NAT world. We can select that we want server address 192.168.5.3 is the address that you would see on the outside, but that translates to 172.16.2.100 on the inside. So by us addressing traffic to 192.168.5.3 or making an HTTP request on port 80, that will become an HTTP request inside of our network in the DMZ on 172.16.2.100 and port 8080. So in this way, we can do settings which are very similar to static NAT. On the LAN to WAN interface, we're able to set settings which are very similar to dynamic NAT, and we can use IP aliases so that we have more addresses than just our WAN interface available if we want to access a specific server using a specific IP address from the external site.